Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on risk retirement for marine renewable energy development. My name is Andrea Copping. I'm a senior researcher at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I have my team here with me, Michaela Freeman, Alicia Gorton, and Lene Hemery. We are in the very fortunate position to be leading an international collaboration on looking at environmental effects of marine renewables, known as OES Environmental, formerly known as Annex IV. And it's the work of this group that we really are presenting here today. Today, I want to just talk a little bit about the purpose of this online workshop today, what we've done previously, and then really focus on this idea of retiring risk. We'll talk about the pathway we've put together, an element of that being the data transferability and Dataset Discoverability matrix. We'll talk about some best management practices for carrying this out, and how one should be collecting data consistently, and end with some case studies, and then let you know sort of where we are in this process and where we're going to. We're very interested in your participation here today. We're going to pause quite a few times through the process and ask for your feedback. Feel free to jump in any time if there's anything you'd like elaboration on. Okay, go ahead. Alrighty, so the background here is there is an ongoing perception from the marine renewables industry that it takes a really long time to get devices in the water, that they find the permitting, the regulatory process long and complicated, and they feel they are being asked to provide a great deal of baseline and monitoring data, which is expensive, and they're worried about that. They also are worried that in future they could be asked to provide costly mitigation. At the same time, we look to you, the regulatory community, for your needs. And we know that you are in a tough position, a challenging position, because you're being asked to permit these new technologies we don't know a great deal about. There aren't always great analogs in other industries. That there aren't very many devices in the water, especially in this country, from which to derive information. And at the same time, your mandate is to protect the oceans and waters and critters, and uphold all federal and state laws and regulations. So it's a tough one. So what we're really trying to do here as OES Environmental is help bridge that gap, provide the information that can help make this smoother. So we're going to be talking about 6 stressors that are elements of putting marine renewable energy devices in the water and operating them, and these shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you. The idea of collision risk around turbines, effects of underwater noise from both tidal turbines and wave devices, potential for electromagnetic fields to cause damage to organisms, changes in habitats, both benthic and pelagic, changes to physical systems such as circulation, and other kinds of, sediment transport, et cetera. And although we can't say much about it at this point, the idea of displacement and barrier effects as larger numbers of devices move along. And that's sort of the universe of what we're trying to think about in this process. So this webinar is entitled Retiring Risk. What do we mean by this? It has been our observation, along with the rest of the community, that for certain interactions, there are some potential risks that probably don't need to be investigated at every small project, every site. By small, we're thinking 1 or 2 or a few devices. So by relying on what we already know from already permitted projects elsewhere, and also research studies and analogous industry information, we think that these risks can be retired for these smaller installations. Now, by retiring a risk, we're not implying it's going off and dying. It can be brought back, and certainly as we get to larger arrays, a number of these interactions will require more investigation. So we have developed this pathway to retiring risk, and I want to spend a few minutes walking through this. We've done this with the Annex IV OES Environmental folks, and are continuing to refine it. We really are interested in your thoughts and changes we can make to make this better. Okay, so this is the overall pathway, so we're just going to walk through it. If you think in terms of, as a regulator, you receive an application. one of the things that is very important, as we all know, is a good project description. It's important to note how many devices you're planning on putting in the water, what will they look like, how will they operate, how will they be anchored, and so on. At the same time, it's important to delineate what marine animals, habitats, perhaps other uses of the ocean are occurring right there. And from looking at that project description and then those receptors, animals, habitats, et cetera, that could be harmed, it's possible to get some kind of definition of the risk. And for example, if certain animals are simply not present, one cannot consider there's a risk to those animals. So defining that risk, determining what it is very important. Then, once we've done that, we are entering into our pathway to retiring risk. And we have a series of stage gates. The first one is really that definition. Is there a likely or plausible risk to a particular animal? For instance, if there's harbor porpoise in an area, is there something about the devices that might cause harm to them? If you determine there is no likely or plausible risk, then there's an off-ramp. We would consider that particular risk for that situation to be retired. But if there's thoughts that there is a reasonable risk, we go into the second stage gate where it's important to examine data. What existing data are there? Do those data provide us enough information to understand the risk and determine it's acceptable, it's low enough risk? If that's the case, there's an off-ramp, and again, we could consider that to be retired, the risk for that stressor under that situation to be retired. If there aren't sufficient data, moving into the third stage gate, it would be important for the applicant, in conjunction with the regulator, to develop a monitoring program, collect those data, and examine them in the same way to see if the risk can be understood and is acceptable. And you'll note over the top of this pathway there are those little dotted purple lines with arrows. This really is to imply that there are feedback loops between and among all of these stage gates. Okay, so if you've collected the data, or the applicant's collected the data, you examine it, you decide that there is still a risk, one then moves into the fourth stage gate, and there may be need for mitigation of that risk, at which point it's important to determine whether there are adequate mitigation measures existing that have been tested and shown to be effective. If that's the case and the risk can be mitigated, again, we have an off-ramp at the bottom where the risk is mitigated and should be acceptable. If there aren't adequate mitigation measures that have been tested and shown effective, one would go into the last of the stage gates, stage gate 5, where it might be necessary to develop and test mitigation measures that could be effective. So again, with new mitigation measures that have been shown to be effective, you can mitigate the risk and have that off-ramp. So again, we may have retired that risk for that situation, for that stressor, that receptor. Now, what if that isn't adequate? One goes into the black arrow at the end, and this is a place where it's probably important that the project be redesigned, be moved, be abandoned. But what we really are after here is a staged process that allows you to systematically go through, gather the information needed, assess that information, analyze it, and determine if it is an acceptable risk. And I do want to note with our purple dotted lines and arrows there, another point, at the time one might put mitigation measures in place, there has to be monitoring to ensure those mitigation measures are acceptable. So that's what all that sort of cloud of arrows is trying to put across there. Okay, so I went through that fairly quickly, and recognizing this is sort of would you go back one slide, just thanks. This is a pretty generic-looking pathway. We'll get a little later in the talk about how we want to apply this in more specific circumstances. But this is we're really interested in what you think about this process, this concept, et cetera. So, love to know your thoughts on this concept of retiring risk. Want to know if this pathway we've created makes sense to you. Wonder if it would be useful to you. Would you use it? Are there others that we ought to be contacting and other changes to it you would want to make? So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts. So at this point, I would like to turn this over to my colleague, Alicia Gordon, who's going to talk about the data transferability process.
Great, thanks, Andrea. My name is Alicia Gorton, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how the data transferability process feeds into this overall pathway to risk retirement. And so, as Andrea has discussed, having access to relevant data and information is extremely important when walking through this pathway to risk retirement. And this is really where the concept of data transferability comes into play, as the data transferability process ensures that the data sets from already permitted projects are readily available and able to be compared among projects. And as Andrea has talked about, we have these feedback loops in those purple dotted arrows and lines where kind of you can transfer data between projects. And specifically within this pathway to risk retirement, the data transferability really comes into play starting in stage gate 2, where we're starting to see if sufficient existing data exists in order to potentially retire a risk. And so if sufficient data does not exist for a specific project, the data transferability process could be employed here to investigate if sufficient data exists at another site based on certain variables and factors that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. And then ultimately, that data and information from that project could be, quote-unquote, transferred or used to inform risk retirement for that original project. So to talk a little bit more about what we mean by data transferability and collection consistency, when we say data transferability, what we're really talking about is being able to use data and information from an already permitted MRE project or an analogous industry to be, quote-unquote, transferred to inform potential environmental effects, permitting, and even risk retirement for a potential future MRE project. And we want to make sure that the data that might be considered for transfer needs to be collected consistently for comparison across multiple projects. And so what do we mean by data? We actually mean data and information. And this is one of the key pieces of feedback that we received from an original engagement workshop with some regulators, is that when they say data and information, they actually are looking for data and information that's been analyzed and synthesized to reach some sort of conclusion. So yes, data could be raw data or quality control data, but what we're talking about here in terms of the data transferability, we're talking about data that has been analyzed and synthesized to reach some sort of conclusion. Next slide, please. And so when we originally engaged some regulators to talk more about this concept of data transferability, we had a series of workshops where we presented them some synthesized data and information for those stressors that Andrea has talked about. And on this slide, we have some example of the information that we presented. On the left-hand side, we have information, a video of a tidal turbine that was tested at EMEC in Scotland. You can see the video being played there. And the whole purpose of this is, again, to just show them what that underwater video actually looks like. It gives just some context as to just how slow the turbine is actually moving, and it gives you an idea of, you know, the marine life in the vicinity of that turbine. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we show some information, some synthesized information on underwater noise from one of the open hydro turbines that was also tested at EMEC. And the chart that you see here is the process data from the underwater sound emitted from the device. And the takeaway here that isn't really in context as it was in the presentation previously was that you can see that the peak of the sound from this device peaks around 132 decibels, which is actually much less than the regulatory thresholds for underwater noise for both marine mammals and fish. And it's also significantly less than noise from shipping, which is actually more in the range of 150 to 180 decibels. So again, we just provided this information to the regulators to be able to put this into perspective. And if you're interested in seeing the full presentation and more of the information that we presented to those regulators, those presentations and recordings are included on the data transferability web page that we're going to include the link at this presentation. So now we're going to walk through the data transferability process, and the development of this process actually began a few years ago and began with a white paper that outlined the proposed framework and several other components of the data transferability process. And we vetted that proposed framework with regulators through a series of workshops and focus groups and have incorporated their feedback into the data transferability process that you see here. And as you can see in this figure, the data transferability process consists of several parts. First, we have the framework that really is just the overarching principles that guide the process of data transfer. We have a data collection consistency table that provides some preferred measurement methods and processes, some reporting units, just to make sure that data is collected consistently across multiple projects. We also have a monitoring dataset discoverability matrix that we're still working on, but this matrix will allow a practitioner, a stakeholder, a regulator, et cetera, to be able to discover data sets for already permitted projects based on the approach that we have in our framework. And then finally, we have a set of best management practices that are related to the data transferability process and data collection consistency. And so what I'll do now is walk through each of these sections of our framework, of our data transferability process. Perfect, thank you. And so first we're going to start with our framework. And the whole objective of the data transferability framework is to develop a common understanding of different types of data and parameters that are used to address potential effects of MRE development. And our framework brings together data sets from already permitted projects in an organized fashion and provides, again, a framework and a structure to compare the applicability of each of these data sets for transfer. And then it just really guides the process for data transfer. And this framework uses the concept of stressors that Andrea has talked about to categorize projects and 4 variables to define an interaction. And you can see the graphic on the bottom there, where those 4 variables include the stressor, whether you're talking about collision risk, underwater noise, EMF, then receptor, so who is going to be the recipient of that stressor, whether it's a marine mammal, and fish, or a diving bird. Then we have to define the site conditions. Are we on the open coast? Are we in a channel? Is the channel deep? Is it wide? Is it shallow, et cetera? And then finally, our technology type. Are we talking about wave or tidal? Is it bottom mounted? Is it floating? So these are the 4 variables that we will use to define an interaction using our framework. Next, we have this concept of the monitoring dataset discoverability matrix. And this matrix will be used to classify and categorize existing monitoring datasets by those 4 variables, including the stressor, the receptor, the site conditions, and technology. And then moving forward, we're also going to categorize data sets by the project size, whether it's a single device or an array. And we're going to use this matrix to discover already permitted data sets and transfer that data to permit future projects. We're currently still working on this matrix. However, it will be a web tool used on TSIS. And so on the next few slides, I'm going to provide a couple examples of how you could walk through this matrix to discover data from already permitted projects. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to look at an example of collision risk. And we're starting with this tree-looking structure that will walk through each of these variables, and we can choose which variable we want to select as we move through this tree. So for example here, the stressor we're going to look at is collision risk. The receptor is marine mammals. Now, if we expanded this table more, you would see that this table is actually extremely large. The other receptors are obviously fish and diving birds, but for this specific example, we're going to take a look at marine mammals. Next, we have to define our site condition, and for this example, we're going to assume that we have a shallow and narrow channel. And then finally, we're going to choose our technology type, and being we're already talking about collision risk, we know we're talking about a tidal turbine, and for this example, we're going to say that the turbine is bottom mounted. So you can kind of see how we've narrowed down the potential projects based on these 4 variables. And once you do that, if you were to use this matrix in this section, you would see that there are some projects here that would have available data. For example, the NCT strength for locks has data available, including post-installation monitoring data related to an aerial survey, harbor seal telemetry, active sonar, passive acoustic sonar, also a shore-based survey. There's also some baseline data available in terms of an aerial survey. We're going to walk through this matrix again for another example, just to put this in perspective using a different stressor. Now we're going to look at underwater noise. That is our stressor, and our receptor is a marine mammal. And then we're going to define our site condition, and for this example, we're going to assume an isolated or quiet environment. And you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, we've defined what the parameters are for an isolated and quiet and also a noisy environment. And then we have to define our technology type. So for this example, we're going to say a wave device. And so again, you can kind of see how we've walked through this matrix and selected the variables one at a time. And if you were to do this using the matrix, you would see that 4 projects have data available. So for example, the Surge Wave Roller has post-installation monitoring data available related to sound characterization and sound propagation using hydrophones, some sort of sound analysis using MATLAB, and also some statistical data analysis. So moving on to the topic of data collection consistency, we know that there's no way for us or any other entity to be able to dictate how data should be collected and analyzed either in this country or worldwide. That's just not going to happen. But however, we believe that we can provide some sort of recommendations to provide consistent processes and units for data collection that can increase our confidence when we transfer data from one project to the next. And now this is an initial table that was developed during a workshop last year that breaks down each stressor. It also provides information on process or measurement tools, and also puts bounds around reporting units and types of analysis and interpretation of the data that's been collected. And so taking a look at the first example on this table where the stressor is collision risk, in terms of measurement tools, you could use some sort of sensors, including acoustic sensors, acoustics plus video. The way that data would be reported could be by the number of visible targets in a field of view, or also by the number of collisions with the turbine. And then the way that data would be analyzed or interpreted is that the number of collisions and or the close encounters or the interactions of those animals with the turbines could then be used to validate collision risk models. And so as I said, this table was initially developed from a workshop last year. However, we're actively collaborating with another DOE-funded project at PNNL called the Triton Initiative to further refine this table based on some field testing. And so to wrap up the data transferability process, we've developed a series of 4 best management practices to really help make the data transferability process more operational, less theoretical, and just to provide some guidance for how to implement the data transferability process. And as you can see here, these best management practices are fairly high level and simple. So for example, the first best management practice should be pretty straightforward and obvious. that in order to transfer data from one site to the next, you have to meet some sort of requirement for some sort of necessary minimum requirement for data transfer. And as part of the data transferability process, we have developed some guidelines for data transferability. We haven't presented them here today. However, if you're interested in what those guidelines are and what those minimum requirements are, we have those included in previous presentations and technical reports on the data transferability webpage on TPIS, and we're going to provide that link at the end of the presentation. So for the second best management practice, this one is to determine likely data sets that meet data consistency needs and quality assurance requirements. This is where the concept of data transferability comes into play, just to ensure that the methods that have been used to collect and analyze data are compatible and will help determine the validity of comparisons. Next, for best management practice 3, this one encourages the use of numerical models in conjunction with and or in place of data sets. And numerical models are a key piece to enhancing our understanding of these interactions. And while there may not be sufficient data that exists yet to develop and validate these models, as more data is collected and the interactions become better understood, like they are with underwater noise, we can begin to model that interaction. And as we do that, data collection efforts may be able to be reduced as we rely more heavily on models. And then finally, for best management practice 4, this one provides context and perspective for data sets to be transferred by encouraging the use of available and pertinent data sets to enhance the interpretation of the data and information that's being investigated. And so for this specific BMP, how would that be implemented? So for example, if you're investigating collision risk, you could also investigate behavioral studies of animals. So specifically, if you're interested in either harbor seals or orca collision with a tidal turbine, you could look at behavioral studies to get a better understanding of how these marine mammals would behave or interact with a turbine. Other contextual information that could be of use include hydrodynamic information, details about the wave climate, or habitat maps. However, for this specific BMP, we want to make sure that this is an opportunistic opportunity. If the ancillary data already exists, it would be really great to use that to provide context and perspective. However, if that data does not exist, we're not suggesting or recommendation that it needs to be collected. And so with that, I'd like to turn this part of the presentation over to my colleague, Michaela Freeman. She's going to talk a little bit about some data transferability case studies that will really help to put the data transferability process into perspective and really give you an idea of how it can be applied. Michaela?
Thanks, Alicia. So I'm going to run through a few examples we've put together. As Alicia mentioned, this is really to show how the data transferability process may work. What we have especially wanted to do is test our framework to see how effective it is and how useful it may be, especially when looking at already permitted projects, and to assess how this process might be used in practice by regulators such as yourselves. And so we really want to show a few examples of how this can work and really help to familiarize regulators, developers, researchers, those who may use this process with it. And we are working on developing and analyzing case studies, so we've pulled out a few examples on some of the key stressors to show today. So I'm going to run through examples on collision risk, EMF, and noise. The first study is focusing on collision risk, and this is a marine current turbine CGen deployment as one of the first full-size turbines that was in the water, deployed from 2009 to 2016 in Northern Ireland. And they had an environmental monitoring program that was specifically designed to detect, prevent, and minimize environmental impacts that could be attributable to the turbine, whether that's installation or operation, and to provide ongoing monitoring strategies to determine if there was adverse impact on habitat, species, or the environment of the area. And this case study specifically is looking at behavior of seals and harbor porpoise in tidal streams around devices, and this is particularly interesting because for harbor seals, this is actually a harbor seal conservation area. And so what they were really trying to do with this environmental monitoring program is speak to that specific risk of harbor seals in the area. And so they used several different monitoring methods, as Alicia mentioned. This was one of the ones that would show up under the data transferability matrix, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. And they used active acoustic monitoring, which consisted of active acoustic sonar to detect marine mammals at sufficient range, and this actually would allow for a triggered and precautionary shutdown when a marine mammal got within 15 meters of the device. They also use active sonar to allow the targets to be observed as they pass the turbine during operation. They use passive acoustic monitoring to measure harbor porpoise activity, looking at presence-absence. They use marine mammal observations, telemetry studies on harbor seals that looked at population distribution and haul-out behavior and transit routes. And then they used aerial surveys of seals haul-outs, which would give an idea of population estimates that they then set in the context of historical data. And last, they used land-based visual observations, both pre- and post-installation, to examine the change in the area and how it was used around the turbine. So overall, during the 3 years of post-installation monitoring, they found that there were no major impacts of the CGen turbine on harbor seals, on gray seals, or on harbor porpoise. They found that there were no mortalities, which could be attributable to the mitigation in place as the turbine had this shut down. They also found there were no detectable changes in the relative abundance or annual counts of seals, and that seals and porpoises regularly moved past the operating turbine. They did find some additional things, such as seals moved at a higher rate during periods of slack tides, indicating avoidance, and there were times when the turbine was not operating so that the seals could actually transit during those times. So CGen has provided a great deal of valuable information on the operation and impact of tidal turbines in the marine environment, particularly for marine mammals. But I did want to point out that because of this precautionary shutdown they had, we learned a lot about marine mammals in the vicinity of the turbines, but because it was shut down, we didn't really learn anything about the specific interactions specifically related to collision risk. They were going to work towards taking away that shutdown, but they didn't get there, so this was really a missed opportunity to learn more about collision risk and how it may affect marine mammals. However, there's still a ton of information that is useful for future marine renewable energy deployments, as it really provides a better understanding of marine mammal behavior in the area, specifically in these high-energy environments that tidal devices are situated in, on near-field behavior around turbine, and the potential risk of collision. And down below, you'll see I've listed, these are the classifications, so similar to those charts that Alicia showed with the data transferability matrix. If you were looking at the data transferability matrix, this is the classification that this specific case study would show up under if you were looking for that type of information. And I listed this for the same other studies as well, just to really bring this full circle with our process. So the next example I want to show focuses on the structure of underwater noise. This is the Klamath Wave Power P2 demonstration that was deployed in 2010 to 2014 at the European Marine Energy Center, EMEC, in Scotland. And there were a few other locations that they also deployed this technology, but we're going to focus on this EMEC deployment. And one thing to note is that the company is no longer in existence, but there's a lot to learn from the work that they did. So we looked at the operational noise specifically on protected species, which is mostly marine mammals and some birds. And what they did is they looked at acoustic measurements, and they specifically did so to determine an underwater sound profile of this P2 device and to produce a noise propagation model for the device. So their initial findings indicated that the noise from the wave device would not rise to levels which may cause injury to these sensitive species. And this actually led to the data being used To conclude that Palamas didn't need to undertake a standard 2-year offshore bird survey, which resulted in significant time and money savings. And as you guys may know, with this industry being young and still, trying to get to commercialization, that's a big deal to have these big time and money savings and to use that data for that purpose. So the results from this monitoring can really inform future data collection for similar devices and devices with similar noise outputs, and also for devices in similar environments. And one example is that in addition to the data being used to show that they didn't need to do the offshore bird survey, these results actually informed key discussion with both regulators and statutory advisors regarding baseline data collection requirements for another Palamas deployment that was in a different area and was a bit larger. Unfortunately, that never got deployed because Palamas went into administration, but it's a really good example of how noise can be and was, how data can be and was transferred between locations. And so overall, this case study really shows how you can help to develop the process for monitoring and modeling these impacts for different deployments. And again, there's the classifications at the bottom that this case study would show up under in the matrix. The last example is a BOEM contracted study that was carried out by University of Rhode Island and other key partners, and this focused on EMS, specifically on lobsters and skates. And this looked at 3 cables, 2 DC cables or direct current cables, which were the crossbound cable in Connecticut and the Neptune cable in New Jersey, and then an AC cable, the Sea to Shore cable in Rhode Island, which is connected to the Block Island Wind Farm. So here the methods that were used is they did a synthesis of existing information or literature review. They did computer simulation and modeling using the console model for both the crossbound cable and the Neptune cable. And they did field studies consisting of collecting data on the subsea cable EMS emissions to really address key knowledge gaps and to validate the model. And they did a field experiment with American lobster and little skate in Long Island Sound, so on the crossbound cable, to assess behavioral responses of sensitive species. And they looked at the movement across the cable within a netted enclosure that they would put these organisms in, and they assessed their reaction to the cable and where they would move about in the enclosure. One thing to note is from this study and others is enclosures are a little bit too small to really see normal behavior, but again, it does give us a good idea of how these animals might react to EMF. So there were a few key things that this study found. One was that the model was an effective tool to both model and simulate EMF for DC cables. They were also working to standardize a protocol for EMF surveys. They used this Swedish electromagnetic low noise apparatus, or SEMLA, tone on a sled, which was a method that comes out of Europe. And then through the field experiments, they were able to see that the cables actually were not a barrier to movement. However, there was statistically significant behavioral responses for both little skates and American lobster, though American lobsters had more subtle changes in behavior. And so bringing this back to data transferability, what we see is that the model that they used, the console model, could be used for future deployments to simulate EMF in place of expensive survey methods. Also, their work on standardizing a model method for EMF surveys gives us somewhere to start, and this can really be built on for further studies and tests of methodologies. And then lastly, the data really furthers our understanding of EMF effects on lobsters and skates, which can be used for similar species and for future deployments. And again, I've listed the classification that this would fall under for the data transferability matrix. And I just want to bring that back to the point in the beginning, is that all of these examples are really helping us to test our framework and to show how this data transferability process can be used. And the big thing that we want to work towards is to get rid of any misunderstandings maybe happening around data transferability and how to use data from already permitted projects. And so we really want to start to familiarize regulators, researchers, developers with this process. So with that, we have several questions that we'd like to ask you, and I know we've gone through a ton of information in this section, so please feel free to ask me to go back to some slides to view those diagrams or whatnot. And again, this will all be contained in the online survey if you need to take a little bit more time to process. But the questions we want to ask as far as data transferability is, does this process make sense to you? Seeing the monitoring dataset discoverability matrix, would you make use of it, and how might you use it? We would love to know if the best management practices could be useful to aid in the transfer of data, and as well, if the data collection consistency table is useful to you, especially if you're permitting a project asking someone to collect their data in specific methods or measurements or whatnot, and then any feedback on the case studies we presented. And I am going to pass it back to Andrea now, who will bring us back to our retiring risk.
Thank you, Michaela. As I mentioned when I walked through the retiring risk pathway, that is very generic. Now we've got to the point where we'd like to test it out. And we think that there are a couple of these interactions that may be ready to at least test on the retiring risk process. We are going to pick two, electromagnetic fields and also underwater noise. We're going to work through this process. We've got a workshop planned in September 5th, around the European Wave and Tidal Energy Conference in Naples, Italy. And this is a good opportunity because UTEC is a venue where we get a lot of international developers, consultants, researchers, and we tend to get regulators, but just from that country or close by. And we will be reaching out specifically to any of the expertise we can manage to get them to this workshop. And the plan is to, with a good deal of work done beforehand, gather together the pertinent data sets and walk through that process, stage gate by stage gate, with available data sets. It happens to work quite well that there's been a couple of European projects funded just in the last little while that are focusing on EMF and underwater noise. So we think that there's going to be some real help there. So that's our plan, and there'll be a report out of that. In terms of how are we going to know if we succeed? What does risk retirement success look like? Well, it's very clear to us that the regulatory community is key to this. We need you guys to embrace this, to modify it, to tell us what you think of it, because if you see this premise as retirement and data transferability as useful, and we can work on it enough to be of use to you, we think that these principles could be applied and really help to, I'm hoping it'll make your jobs easier, but also really help to bring the different parties, the development community, the other stakeholders together on this. At the same time, it's important that the device and project developers understand this, they recognize the value of the process, and they commit to collecting and providing the data that will help support this. Like any of these kinds of processes, I think getting it off the ground is slow because we don't have a lot of data sets, but as we add more data sets, provided they are collected in a way that is compatible, we think this can grow quite rapidly and become quite useful so that it will be more analogous to other industries that you carry out regulatory processes for. Similarly, we think the researchers and the consultancies who provide a lot of the services to the project developers need to be aware of this. They need, again, to commit to being willing to collect data that are compatible and useful. And from the workshops that we've had around this topic and those that we've talked to in other countries, there seems to be a willingness to do this. I think everyone in this field is pretty committed to trying to find a path forward. But we're not trying to take what we have developed so far and vet it somewhat and ram it down anybody's throat. We really need your feedback on what's useful. Okay, so in terms of next steps, any feedback we got, we had one of these workshops 2 days ago and got a lot of quite spirited discussion. And any of this feedback we will incorporate, and we are continuing to work with the other countries who are doing similar activities, not quite where we are yet, but they're getting there. And we'll continue to work on particularly developing the Dataset discoverability matrix. As Michaela said, we're just at the beginning of this. We've got a big table of a whole series of projects and data sets that we think fit, and now we have to kind of put it all together and make it accessible. We are working out more of these data transferability case studies that Michaela mentioned, and examples for risk retirement. And eventually this will become a web-based tool that will be up on Tethys for use. We have talked about a lot of these things that are on Tethys. There are a bunch of the links, and as again we've said, all these things will be available on Tethys, so you don't have to know all these. Just get to Tethys and search for data transferability or risk retirement, and you'll get there. The risk retirement page is still under development, so please check back in a bit. The data transferability one's got a lot of information up already. Okay, and I think that's it. So I just want to really thank you for taking the time with us here today. There's the contact information for me and the rest of the team. We'd like to hear from you at any point, so feel free to reach out. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll conclude here today. Again, thank you very much for spending the time with us, and Michaela will be following an online survey and indicating to you where the slides can be found. And incidentally, if any of you on the phone have others in the room with you that we don't know about, if you send on their contact information, we'll make sure that they receive all of this as well. Okay, with this, I think we're all done. Thank you.